In this session, we are going to discuss Psalms of Lament. We said that the Psalms are instructions in how to pray, and one of the more common prayers that we pray is a prayer of lament. It's been estimated that 1/3 of the Psalms are laments or have elements of lament in them. Glenn Pemberton, in his book on lament, says that there are 5 elements of a lament, and these can occur in any order. In fact, that typically is the nature of a lament. Sometimes we're all over the place emotionally when we're grieving and when we're crying out to God. And so these 5 elements can be in different orders, but most laments will contain these 5. The first is address. When we are crying out a song of grief, of prayer, or a prayer of frustration or disappointment with God, we select certain words to address God. The most common name for God in the Psalms is Lord, Yahweh. In the English, it's Lord, all caps. This is the most personal, intimate name of God, his divine name, his covenant name. But there are times where the psalmist addresses God as Elohim, or even shorter, Eli, my God. And this suggests a distancing, that this is the name of the high God, more of a generic name for God rather than the personal name of God. There are also many metaphors for God. The psalmist will address God as my rock, my fortress, deliverer, my rescuer, etc. So we think about the terms that we use to address God when we're crying out to him. For us as Christians, it could be Abba, a Father. It could be as the Holy One, the Mighty One, etc. So we address God in very specific terms in lament. And then we also give a complaint. And that really is the heart of lament, isn't it? It is this expression of disappointment with God, that there's a circumstance that doesn't seem right, that's not fair. Maybe it's sickness, maybe it's a betrayal, maybe it's a battle or some kind that we're dealing with. And we complain to God that it's not fair, it's not right. God, do something about this. And that leads us to the third element of lament, and that's a request, and often a series of requests. God, intervene, act, do something, rescue me, save me from this. And then the fourth element is that of motivation. And by this, we mean we want to motivate God to action. We want to give him reasons to act. And sometimes that's because the psalmist is just simply at the end of his life. He says, God, if you don't do something, I'm going to die. Or, God, if you don't do something, you're going to look bad, because after all, you're my God. I trust in you. And if you fail me, then, hey, that's on you. Your glory is what's at stake here. And then the psalmist always includes this element of confidence or trust. There's only one exception, and that's Psalm 88. Every other psalm of lament has this element of future orientation that says, God, I don't know how you're going to get me out of this. I don't know how you're going to answer this, but I trust you regardless. Well, we're going to look at what is probably the most familiar of the Psalms of Lament, and that's Psalm 22. It's a prayer of David. We don't know exactly the circumstance of this psalm, but David was in a very desperate situation. He was facing what seemed to be the end of his life when he prayed these words, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my words of groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer by night, and I find no rest. Notice that he uses my God, Eli, the shortest form of that, when he addresses this complaint. And in this first movement of this psalm, which contains 3 movements, David describes that he is alone. He's utterly alone. He calls out to God but gets no answer. It's continual, day and night. He prays 3 times. Why? Why are you not even listening to the words of my groaning? He begins to try to comfort himself in verse 3. He says, yet you are holy. You are enthroned on the praises of Israel. And you, our fathers, trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried and were rescued. And you they trusted, and they were not put to shame. He looks around at his community, and he sees other people who are trusting in God, and God seems to be taking care of them. He looks back in history and says, our fathers trusted you, and you rescued them. That only makes him feel even more alone, more cut off, because everyone else seems to be doing just fine, but not him. And that brings us to what is perhaps the low point of this psalm in verse 6. He says, I'm a worm and not a man. I'm scorned by mankind, despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. David says, I am like the lowest form of life. I am a mere maggot, unclean, feeding on the dead, meaningless, worthless. He feels utterly cut off from even his humanity. And those people that are around him are simply mocking him, and particularly mocking his faith. Continues in verse 9, yet you are he who took me from the womb. You made me trust you at my mother's breasts. On you was I cast from my birth, and from my mother's womb. You've been my God. David now looks back over his own life. He goes back to the beginning, to his birth and his upbringing. He says, God, you have been with me my whole life. You have been faithful. And that's why this is so painful, because you don't seem to be listening now. You don't seem to be with me now. Where did you go, God? In fact, that's where this first stanza ends. Verse 11, he says, do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there's none to help. David's first complaint is that he is utterly alone, abandoned by humanity, abandoned by his own family. He's ridiculed. He doesn't even feel human. He feels like a worm. And ultimately, though, he is abandoned, he feels, by God. He's utterly alone. The second movement of this psalm is a bit of a contrast to the word alone, because he'll use the word encircled. He is both alone, but also encircled. In verse 12, many bulls encompass me. Strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. His enemies are like bulls, lions that are surrounding him, pressing against him, seeking to devour him. Verse 14, I'm poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It melts within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, that is a broken piece of pottery cast away on the ground. My tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. David describes his physical suffering. He is at the end of life. In verse 16, dogs encompass me. A company of evildoers encircles me. They've pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. At the end of his life, David is surrounded by enemies who want his stuff. He's saying, he's as good as dead. Let's go ahead and get his stuff. Let's take our inheritance from him. Then there is a dramatic turn. In verses 19 through 21, David prays, but you, O Lord, and there the term of address changes from Eli to Yahweh, my covenant God. Do not be far, O you, my help, another term of address. Come quickly to my aid. Deliver my soul from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion. You've rescued me from the horns of the wild ox. And he mentions all those animals that were his enemies and saying, God, you have rescued me. There is this dramatic turn towards trust, towards confidence and hope in the future. And that's borne out in the final movement of this psalm, which is that David realizes that he is indeed seen by God. God hasn't hidden his face. God hasn't abandoned him. God sees. And so David immediately turns to worship in advance of the deliverance that he anticipates to come. In verse 22, he says, I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you. Verse 24, for he has not despised or abhorred the affliction of the afflicted. He has not hidden his face from him, but has heard when he cried to him. And then David goes on to invite all of Israel to praise, and indeed all of the world. In verse 26, he says, the afflicted shall eat. Verse 27, all the ends of the earth shall remember. The families of nations shall worship before you. Verse 28, kingship belongs to the Lord. He asserts God's sovereignty over all things. Verse 29, the prosperous of the earth, the rich, shall eat and worship, and before him shall bow all who go down to the dust. All will bow the knee before him. Verse 30, posterity shall serve him. It shall be told to the Lord, to the coming generation. They shall come and proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, that he has done it. David makes this dramatic move to confidence, and fully 1/3 of this psalm is indeed an expression of praise and trust that God, I'm not alone. I may be encircled by enemies, but you see me and you are with me. Now, of course, as we have prayed this psalm, we realize that we're not alone in praying this, that David gave Jesus the words to pray from the cross. And, Jesus quoted this psalm from the cross. It's probably why it's so familiar. The very first verse, Jesus said, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. In Aramaic, my God, why have you forsaken me? The first of the 7 sayings of Jesus from the cross. And I would suggest that Jesus not only prayed that first verse, but the entire psalm, that if not, he didn't pray it out loud, at least it was in his mind, and it would have been heard by those that were with him. Indeed, this psalm describes in graphic detail the crucifixion of Jesus, even long before crucifixion even existed. The Romans invented crucifixion, so David knew nothing of it when he writes of his bones being out of joint and his piercing of his hands and feet. And yet these words so accurately describe the suffering of Jesus on the cross. The heart melting within him. Doctors who have discussed and studied crucifixion will tell you that crucifixion typically, the cause of death was from heart failure. It could be from a couple things. It could be from asphyxiation. It's known that many victims of crucifixion would live for days on the cross. In fact, that's why they had to break the bones, the leg bones of those who were hanging on the cross with Jesus on either side of him. Jesus, of course, passed in 6 hours on the cross, and that wasn't necessary. But the physics of it are that when you're suspended like this, it's difficult to breathe. And so the victim of crucifixion would need to pull themselves up in order to catch a breath and then relax until they could hold it no longer and breathe again. And eventually that led to a depletion of oxygen and heart failure. Other physicians say that Jesus perhaps died of blood loss, that the beatings, the scourgings, the piercing of the hands and feet, all of this resulted in massive blood loss. And ultimately, he died of heart failure, a broken heart. The piercing of the hands and feet is a fascinating detail. In the Hebrew, the text is that they are at my hands and feet like a lion, suggesting that these enemies of David are just about to tear him limb from limb. The Greek translation of this psalm, the Septuagint, that's 3rd century BC, used the word oruso, which means to dig. They have dug my hands and feet. Jerome, translating this into the Latin later after Christ, translates it as pierced, and that's where we get our translation today. But this idea of being restrained, being pinned, is inherent in that. And the idea of, obviously, of Jesus experiencing the nails in his hands and feet are there. And then we have the psalm that has described in detail the crucifixion of Jesus. It makes me wonder, what about that last stanza? Yes, Jesus experienced loneliness and separation from God. He was encircled by his enemies. Was Jesus also seen? Oh, yes. Yes, of course. Jesus did pray, I think, this last stanza, this great expression of praise. In fact, the writer of Hebrews puts verse 22 in the mouth of Jesus, where he says, I will praise you in the presence of the congregation. I think Jesus, in his last moments on the cross, looked out and could see us. He could see the church. He could see the future kingdom, rich, poor, young, old, those yet unborn. He could see them worshiping, feasting, and acknowledging the supremacy of God. I say that because of the final words of this psalm, verse 30. The psalmist prays, posterity shall serve him. It shall be told of the Lord to the coming generation. They shall come and proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, that he has done it. He has done it. That's very similar to the final words of Jesus from the cross. It is finished. It is accomplished. And Jesus, as he was suffering on the cross, I believe could see us, could see that future, could see the kingdom, could see what his suffering would produce, would give to us as the church. This psalm reminds us of this very powerful truth when it comes to suffering, and that is that God suffers with us. It's a tremendous resource when we are praying these psalms of lament to know that God is not distant, but God is indeed suffering with us. Psalm 56:8 says that God has kept our tears in a bottle, that he counts each of them, that he records them on a scroll. God suffers with us. We see this in Jesus, in two of the most powerful words in the New Testament, in my opinion, in John 11, When Jesus goes to the funeral of Lazarus, his dear friend, he arrives late and Lazarus is dead. He's already wrapped. His body is in the tomb. And when Jesus arrives, Lazarus' sisters, Mary and Martha, they're very upset because Jesus, if you had gotten here sooner, this wouldn't have happened. And yet, Jesus, knowing what he is going to do, knowing that in a matter of moments, he is going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and mourning is going to turn into dancing, and sorrow is going to turn into joy. Before he does that, the text says that Jesus wept. He grieved with them. He suffered with them. He came alongside them. And this is our God, the God who suffers with us. Some may ask, how can God suffer? After all, he is God. He is omnipotent. Can't he just make himself immune from that pain? I don't think so. I think Jesus on that cross in those 6 hours experienced the totality of human suffering in a degree that we can never imagine. Some might ask, how is that possible? How could God experience suffering? Let me illustrate it this way. A few years ago, we were catching fireflies in the backyard. And as would have it, as you're capturing fireflies, there's also occasional carnage. There's a firefly that gets caught in the lid or something. And that happened that day. And we had a conversation with the students that were there at their house. And now, do insects experience pain? And we concluded that, yeah, probably on some level, there's some kind of neurological response, but it's pretty primitive. And that got us thinking, well, what about higher animals, say a pet? Now, we had a pet, a dog, that was with us for 11 years. And when he passed, it was sad. And I'm sure there was some suffering and pain near the end. And we grieved, and there was some loss there. But that was a higher order of being than a firefly, right? Now, if someone were to lose a son, a loved one, to die of a disease, and to watch them suffer, that's a whole nother level of suffering and pain and grief that we would go through. And now I ask you, God, who is of an infinitely higher order of being than you and I, how much suffering would he endure? Could he possibly endure? That's why I believe on the cross that Jesus didn't take any anesthesia. He didn't limit his suffering, but he embraced the entire totality of human suffering. He alone could do that because as God, as this higher order of being, he could endure a higher order of suffering. Oh, Jesus suffered for us. And when we pray these Psalms of Lament, we can be confident that Jesus is praying them with us. The writer of Hebrews said that Jesus, in his days on the earth, prayed with loud cries and tears. Indeed, in the garden, he prayed for hours. He lamented. Jesus laments with us. And that gives us tremendous comfort when we pray Psalms of Lament, when we endure grief and challenge. You know, there are many different approaches in religion and philosophy to this problem of suffering and grief. Buddhists say that, well, the problem with pain is you just need to deny it. Just use the power of your mind and meditation and achieve nirvana and deny suffering. In Hinduism, they say that, well, it's reincarnation. It's simply if you are a good person, that maybe in the next life there'll be a little less suffering. And that's about the best we can do, is hope for a little less as we are reincarnated over and over again. Islam will say, well, Allah is Allah, and he does what he does, and there is no meaning, there is no purpose. It's just fatalism. It's just whatever God allows, that's what he does. Atheists will say, well, there is no God, and so pain is to be avoided. And so we medicate and we pursue pleasure and we do whatever we can to numb any pain and suffering that we might feel because there's no meaning, purpose to it. But the New Testament and Christianity teaches a different view. It says, first of all, that God is with us in our suffering, that suffering is a reality of life. In a fallen world, we will suffer. But the good news is that Jesus is with us in every sense of that word. And the New Testament also teaches us that God redeems suffering. Psalm 22 tells us this, that the suffering of David was the prayer of Jesus, and that through Jesus' suffering, atonement came. God redeems suffering. He makes something of it. He gives meaning to it and purpose to it. And so when we pray these Psalms of Lament, we can be confident that we're not alone, even though we may feel it. We're not encircled by enemies. We are in fact surrounded by God's presence. He sees our suffering. He prays with us. He laments with us. And that is good news.